What's going on, guys? This is Britter, and we're back with Free Code Camp's new responsive web design, and we are going to be working on Learn CSS Colors by building a set of colored markers. So let's jump into it. And this is a preview of what we're going to build, so let's get started. As you've seen in the previous projects, web pages should start with a doctype HTML declaration followed by an HTML element. Add a doctype HTML declaration at the top of the document and an HTML element after that. Give the HTML element a lang attribute with an in as its value. So we gotta do, oh, why isn't it typing in there? Doctype HTML. Alright, and then after that, an HTML element. And lang equals English as its value. And then we do HTML. Check your code. And it's right. So let's go to the next challenge. Step 2. Nest a head element within the HTML element. Just after the head element, add a body element. So we're going to do head, then we're going to do body, and then we're going to close the body, and then we're going to close the head. Oh wait, nope, I lied. We're going to do a head, and then we're going to close the head, and then the body. And it's correct. Remember what the title element gives search engines and extra information about the page. It also tells browsers what text to display in the title bar when the page is open and on the tab for the page. Within the head element, nest a title element with the text colored markers. Alright. Ask me later. To tell browsers how to encode characters on your page, set the char set to UTF-8. It is a universal character set that includes almost every character from all human languages. Inside the head element, set the char set. Do I do that? Title. Where do I do that? I forgot where to do that at. Char set. That's not right. HTML. Char set equals UTF-8. Let's see if that's right. And then inside the head element, nest a meta element with the attribute. Oh. Okay. So this was wrong. So inside the head we do that. So meta char set equals UTF-8. Remember that meta elements are self-closing, so we don't have to close that one. Okay, so go to next. Alright, add another self-closing meta element within the head and give it the name attribute set to viewport and a content attribute set to width equals device minus width. Initial scale equals 1.0. Okay, close that and submit. Now you're ready to start adding content to the page. Within the body, nest an H1 element with the text CSS color markers. Okay. Wait a minute, why doesn't it pass? Oh, I didn't close it. Come on, Britter. There we go. All right. In this project, you'll work with an external CSS file to style the page. We've already created a style.css file for you, but before you can use it, you'll need to link it to the page. Nest a link element within the head. So link element within the head, give it the rel attribute set equal style sheet and a href attribute set to styles.css. Alright, and we gotta close that. I don't remember if they're self-closing. I don't think they are. Oh, they must be. Okay, cool. Alright, now that your external CSS file is set up, you can start styling the page. As a reminder, here's how to target a paragraph element and align it to the right. Now that your external CSS file is set up, you can start styling the page. Create a new CSS rule that targets the H1 element and set its text align property to center. So we want to do H1, curly Q, curly bracket, text align, and set it to center. And it centered it. Now you'll add some elements that you'll eventually style into color markers. First, within the body, add a div element and set its class attribute to container. So div and class equals container. Make sure the div element is below the H1 element. Okay. I don't remember if this is self-closing or not. I don't think it is. Yeah. Your div element should have a class attribute set to container equals container. So what am I doing wrong there? Class div class equals container. Div, that's not right. Div class equals container. Let's see if it's self-closing. I don't think it is. You should have a closing div tag, okay? Did I spell container wrong before? Or something? I must have spelled container wrong, because I feel like I did this. Alright. Next, within the div, add another div element and give it a class of marker. Within the div, add another div element and give it the class. Within the div, why would I do it? Within here, go class equals marker. Your new div element should have an opening tag. Okay, so it literally meant within it, which is weird to me, but okay. Div class equals marker. And then close it. Alright. It's time to add some color to the page. Remember that one way to add color to an element is to use a color keyword like black, cyan, or yellow. As a reminder, here's how to target the class Freedom Code Camp. Create a new CSS rule that targets the class marker and set its background color property to red. So we need to do dot marker and then curly brackets and then set background color to red. Okay, that worked. Submit and go to next challenge. Notice that your marker doesn't seem to have any color. The background color was actually applied, but since the marker div element is empty, it doesn't have any height by default. In your dot marker CSS rule, set the width property to 200 pixels and height property to width is 200 pixels and the height should be 25 pixels. And there we go. Now we got our marker there. Your marker would look better if it was centered on the page. An easy way to do that is with the margin shorthand property. In the last project, you set the margin area of elements separately with properties like margin type and margin left. The margin shorthand property makes it easy to set multiple margin areas at the same time. To center your marker on the page, set its margin property to auto. So margin auto. Okay. Now that you've got one marker centered with color, it's time to add the other markers. In the container div, add 2 more div elements and give them each a class of marker. Alright, so div class equals marker. Close it. Div. In the container div. Oh. Yeah, we're in the right spot. Div class marker. And then we gotta close it, I think. Your new div elements should both have a class of marker. They do. Div class marker in the container div. So div class marker, div class marker. Let's just start it. Okay, so now in your div, in the container div, so we'll do, so really we should have 2 more of these exact things, so congratulations. Okay, so I must have typed something wrong. While you have 3 separate marker div elements, they look like one big rectangle. You should add some space between them to make it easier to see each element. When the shorthand margin property has 2 values, it's set margin top, margin bottom to the first value, and margin left and margin right to the second value. In your marker CSS rule, set the margin property to 10 pix auto. Alright, so change this to 10 pix auto. There we go. We got 3 now. To give the markers different colors, you will need to add a unique class to each one. Multiple classes can be added to an element by listing them in the class attribute and separating them with a space. For example, the following adds both the animal and dog classes to a div element. To begin, add the class 1 to the first marker div element. So marker 1. Okay. Next, remove the background color property and its value from the marker rule. Okay. Then create a new CSS rule that targets the class 1 and set its background color property to red. So we want to do marker 1 up. Oh no, restart, because I deleted some stuff I wasn't supposed to. Alright, so we're going to do dot marker 1 and then background color red. What did I do wrong here? There we go. So only the 1. So now we got to add 2 and 3. Create a CSS rule that targets the class 2 and set its background color property to green. Alright, so 2 background color green. And then we need to do 3 background color blue. And there we go. We got 3 markers now. There are 2 main color models, the additive RGB, red, green, blue, model used in electronic devices, and the subtractive CMYK cyan, magenta, yellow, black model used in print. In this project, you'll work with the RGB model. This means that colors begin as black and change as different levels of red, green, and blue are introduced. An easy way to see this is with the CSS RGB function. Create a new CSS rule that targets the class container, so dot container, and set its background color to black with RGB. So RGB 0, 0, 0. A function is a piece of code that can take an input and perform a specific action. The CSS RGB function accepts values or arguments for red, green, and blue and produces a color. Each red, green, and blue value is a number from 0 to 255. 0 means that there's 0% of that color and is black. 255 means that there's 100% of that color. In the one CSS rule, place the color keyword red, replace the color keyword with the RGB function. So here we want to do RGB red, we want to do 255 0 0. Notice that the background color for your marker is still red. This is because you set the red value of the RGB function to the max of 255 or 100% red and set both the green and blue values to 0. Now use the RGB function to set the other colors. So for blue, we want to do RGB 0, 0, 255. And then for green, we want to do RGB 0, 255, 0. And get our, there we go. While the red and blue markers look the same, the green one is much lighter than it was before. This is because the green color keyword is actually a darker shade and is about halfway between black and the maximum value for green. In the toCSS rule, set the green value in the RGB function to 127 to lower its intensity. Now add a little more vertical space between your markers and the edge of the container elements they're in. In the container CSS rule, use the shorthand padding property to add 10 pixels. So we're going to do padding 10 pixels. Okay, this works similarly to the shorthand margin property used earlier. Wait a minute, why doesn't it work? Your container CSS rule should have a padding property set to 10 pixels. And then 0. In the additive RGB color model, primary colors are colors that, when combined, create pure white. But for this to happen, each color needs to be at its highest intensity. Before you combine colors, set your green marker back to pure green for the RGB function in the .2 CSS rule. Set green to the max. Okay. Now that you have the primary RGB colors, it's time to combine them. For the RGB function in the container rule, set red, green, and blue values to both max. Now it's yellow, and now it's white. Secondary colors are the colors you get when you combine primary colors. You might have noticed some secondary colors in the last step as you change the red, green, and blue values. To create the first secondary color, yellow, update the RGB function in the one CSS rule to combine pure red and pure green. So we're going to need to do 255. To To create the next secondary color cyan, update the RGB function in the 2 to combine pure green and pure blue. To create the final secondary color magenta, update the RGB function in 3 to combine pure blue and pure red. Now that you're familiar with secondary colors, you'll learn how to create territory colors. Territory colors are created by combining a primary with a nearby secondary color. To create the territory color orange, update the RGB function in the 1 CSS rule so that red is at its max value and set green to 127. So red is at max and green should be at 127. Notice that to create orange, you had to increase the intensity of red and decrease the intensity of the green RGB values. This is because orange is the combination of red and yellow and falls between the two colors on the color wheel. To create the territory color spring green, combine cyan with green, update the RGB function in the 2 CSS rules so that green is at the max value and set blue to 127. So blue 120. What happened? 127. I must have hit number lock. There we go. And to create the territory color violet, combine magenta with blue, update the RGB function in the 3 CSS rules so that blue is at the max value and set red to 127. There are 3 more territory colors: chartreuse green, green and yellow, azure blue, and rose red and magenta. To create chartreuse green, update the RGB function in the 1 rule so that red is at 127 and set green to the max value. For azure, update function 2 so that green is at 127 and blue is at max value. And then background 3 for rose, which is sometimes called bright pink, update the RGB function in 3 so that blue is at 127 and red is at the max value. Pretty cool. Now that you've gone through all the primary, secondary, and territory colors on the color wheel, it'll be easier to understand other color theory concepts and how they impact design. First, in the rules 1, 2, 3, adjust the values in the RGB function so that the background color of each element is set to pure black. Remember that RGB functions uses the additive color model where colors start as black and changes the values of red and green increase. So we're going to set them all to black. A color wheel is a circle where similar colors or hues are near each other and different ones are further apart. For example, pure red is between the hues rose and orange. 2 colors that are opposite from each other on the color wheel are called complementary colors. If 2 complementary colors are combined, they produce gray, but when they are placed side by side, these colors produce strong visual contrast and appear brighter. In the RGB function for the 1 CSS rule, set the red value to the max of 255 to produce pure red. In the RGB function for 2, set the values for green and blue. Okay, so 1 is going to be red. 2 is going to be green. Wait a minute. In the 1 CSS rule, set the red value to the max. In the RGB function for 2, set the values for green and blue to the max. Notice that the red and cyan colors are very bright right next to each other. This contrast can be distracting if it's overused on a website, and can make the text hard to read if it's placed on a complementary colored background. It's better practice to choose one color as the dominant color and use its complementary color as an accent to bring attention to certain content on the page. First, in the H1 rule, use the RGB function to set its background color to cyan. So our background color cyan. For each one, CSS role should have a background color property. Oh, it wants me to set it with RGB. RGB 0, 255, and delete all of that. Next, in the one rule, use the RGB function to set the background color to black. So and in the 2, set it to red. I feel like we're just learning the different RGB colors in this one. Notice how your eyes are naturally drawn to the red color in the center. When designing a site, you can use this effect to draw attention to important headings, buttons, or links. There are several other important color combinations outside of complementary colors, but you'll learn those a little bit later. For now, use the RGB function in the 2 rule to set the background color to black. And so we're going to do 0. Add in the H1 rule. In the H1 rule, remove the background color property and value to go back to default white color. Now it's time to add other details to the marker, starting with the first one. In the first marker div element, change the class 1 to red. Update the 1 class selector to the new red class. And update the RGB function in the red rule so that the red value is at max. Next, change class 2 to green and the class 3 to blue. Now we gotta update this to green and update this one to blue. A very common way to apply color to an element with CSS is with hexadecimal or hex values. While hex values sound complicated, they're really just another form of RGB values. Hex color values start with a number character and take 6 characters from 0 to 9 and A to F. The first pair of characters represent red, the second pair represent green, and the third pair represent blue. For example, in the green CSS rule, set the background color property to a hex color code with the values of 00 for red, FF for green, and 00 for blue. You may already be familiar with decimal or base 10 values, which go from 0 to 9. Hexadecimal or base 16 values go from 0 to 9, then A to F. With the hex color, 00 is 0% of that color and FF is 100%. So 00FF 00 translate to 0% red, 100% green, and 0% blue, and is the same as RGB 0, 255, 0. Lower the intensity of green by setting green value of the hex color to 7F. The HSL color model, or hue, saturation, and lightness, is another way to represent colors. The CSS HSL function accepts 3 values: a number from 0 to 360 for hue, a percentage from 0 to 100 for saturation, and a percentage from 0 to 100 for lightness. If you imagine a color wheel, the hue red is at 0 degrees, green is at 120 degrees, and blue is at 240 degrees. Saturation is the intensity of a color from 0% or gray to 100% for pure color. Lightness is how bright a color appears from 0% or complete black to 100% complete white, with 50% being neutral. In the blue CSS rule, use the HSL function to change the background color property to pure blue. Set the hue to 240 the saturation to 100%, and the lightness to 50%. So use the HSL function to change the background color property to pure blue. So HSL, is it done like this? Set the hue to 240, saturation to 100, and the lightness to 50. Your dot blue CSS rule should have a background color property set to HSL 240, 100, 50. Oh, do I have to do the percent signs? Probably. Yes. Okay. You've learned a few ways to set flat colors in CSS, but you can also use a color transition or gradient on an element. A gradient is when one color transitions into another. The CSS linear gradient function lets you control the direction of the transition along a line and which colors are used. One thing to remember is that the linear gradient function actually creates an image element and is usually paired with the background property, which can accept an image as a value. In the red CSS rule, change the background color property to background. So we're going to do this and go background. Oh. I changed the whole thing instead of the word, so it should be RGB 255 0 0, and then let's close it. Your red CSS rule should have a background property let's reset. Change the background color property to background. That's what I did. Okay, I must have did something wrong. The linear gradient function is very flexible. Here's the basic syntax you'll use in this tutorial. Gradient direction is the direction of the line used for the transition. Color 1 and 2 are color arguments, which are the colors that will be used in the transition itself. These can be any type of color, including color keywords, hex, RGB, or HSL. Now you'll apply a red to green gradient along a 90-degree line to the first marker. In the red CSS rule, set the background property to linear gradient and pass it the value 90 degrees as the gradient direction. Okay, so background property to linear gradient and 90 degrees. Okay. You'll use the RGB function for the colors of this gradient. In the linear gradient function, use the RGB function to set the first color argument to pure red. In the linear gradient function, so RGB 255 0 0. Is that what we do? I don't think so. Oh no, that was right. You won't see gradient yet because the linear gradient function needs at least 2 color arguments to work. In the same linear gradient function, use the RGB function to set the second color argument to pure green. So then we want to do RGB 0 255 0. Here's, okay, so background property set to linear gradient 90 degrees, RGB. Oh, I didn't put a comma there. Man, one thing can mess up your whole code, guys, so be careful of that. As you can see, the linear gradient function produces a smooth red to green gradient, while the linear gradient function needs a minimum of 2 color arguments to work. It can accept many color arguments. Use the RGB function to add pure blue as the third color argument to the linear gradient function. So we're going to do comma RGB, and we're going to set 0 0 255. Color stops allow you to fine-tune where colors are placed along the gradient line. They are a length unit like px or percentages that follow a color in the linear gradient function. For example, in this red to black gradient, the transition from red to black takes place at the 90% point along the gradient line, so red takes up most of the available space. In the linear gradient function, add a 75% color stop after the first red argument. So we're going to do 75%. 90 degrees. Oh. Red. 75%. Let me delete this. Linear gradient, 90 degrees. Oh, so it needs to come after the red. Got it. 75%. There we go. Now that you know the basics of how the linear gradient function and color stops work, you can use them to make the markers look more realistic. In the linear gradient function, set gradient direction to 180 degrees. Next, set the color stop for red to 0%. The color stop for green to 50%. And the color stop for blue to 100%. Now that the color stops are set, you'll apply different shades of red to each color argument in the linear gradient function. The shades on the top and bottom edges of the marker will be darker, while the one in the middle will be lighter, as if there's a light above it. For the first color argument, which is currently pure red, update the RGB function so the value for red is 122, and the value for green is 74, and the value for blue is 14. Now modify the second color argument in the linear gradient function, which is currently set to pure green. Update the RGB function so that the value is 245, 62, and 113. Finally, modify the third argument in the linear gradient function, which is currently pure blue. Update the RGB function so that red is 162, the value of green is 27, and the value of blue is 27. The red marker is looking much more realistic. Now you'll do the same for the green marker using a combination of the linear gradient functions and hex colors. In the .green CSS rule, change the background color property to background. Okay guys, we're going to go ahead and stop here. We're at 40 minutes, but I will see you on the next one and we'll continue making our markers. Bye!